Rhetoric, Eco knew growing up in fascist Italy, was the cheapening of language, the emptying of all nuance, the slogan for the slogan's sake, and the deferring of critical thinking to the Duce, the Führer. When the fascist regime in Italy fell, the newspapers were full of stories of other parties, other viewpoints, of debate. That's when Eco discovered that freedom of speech is freedom from rhetoric. But what's actually going on when we use terms like fascist? It comes from the Italian fascismo, which literally means bundle of sticks, but how does its meaning change over time? In contrast to ideologies like liberalism or socialism, fascism as a concept has been notoriously difficult to define. One popular definition comes from historian Stanley G. Payne. He argues that fascism is defined by three things. First, the fascist negations, that it's anti-something, anti-communist, anti-liberal, etc. Second, the fascist goals, that it aims to create a nationalist dictatorship and regulate the economy. And third, the fascist style, that it has a distinct populist aesthetic that romanticizes something, i.e. the past. Another concise definition comes from Roger Griffin, who defines it as Palingenetic ultranationalism, Palingenetic meaning rebirth. The problem is that some examples of fascism fall outside of any definition. Eco said that while he agreed fascism had no quintessence, was a fuzzy totalitarianism, and that it was philosophically out of joint, it nonetheless was firmly fastened to some archetypal foundations. He argues that fascism involves 14 things: a cult of tradition, the rejection of modernism, of enlightenment, of the individual. Action for action's sake instead of thought, a distrust of intellectuals. Disagreement is treason. Disagreement is diversity, while fascism seeks consensus. A mass frustration. Common purpose, nationalism, communitarianism. A sense of humiliation, an unjust but powerful enemy, say. Life is lived for the struggle. A contempt for the weak. Everyone can be the hero. Machismo, power, weaponry, sexual prowess. Selective populism, majority will. A newspeak, impoverished language. But how many of these are necessary for someone to be a fascist? Historian Roger Griffin describes a fascist minimum, but where does that lie? How many points are involved? A final approach emphasises fascism's incoherence, that fascism was so varied that any attempt to define it will be bound to fail. And on top of this, the dictators were incoherent anyway, with no coherent ideology. If this is true, does that mean that the term too is imprecise and then useless? The sociologist Max Weber argued that any concept had an ideal type. All concepts have a number of elements in common, even though some of them could be missing from any individual case. Take a dog. You could describe it as having 4 legs, 2 eyes, a tail, it barks, etc. But it can have 3 legs and still be a dog. It can not bark and still be a dog. So what's going on philosophically when we describe a certain person or a certain state of affairs as fascist? Are we really just describing? Up until the early 20th century, most philosophers of language thought that language was just that, describing the world. But in the 50s, the British philosopher J.L. Austin gave a series of lectures that changed that. Building upon Ludwig Wittgenstein's observation that we engage in what he called language games, Austin argued that in speaking, we're not just describing things, but doing something in describing them, and understanding that doing was central to any philosophical problem. Austin was engaging in a kind of linguistic phenomenology. He saw that utterances could be descriptive. They could describe some state of affairs in the world. like the cat is on the mat. These statements were true or false and could be, or should be at least, verifiable. But statements or utterances could also be what he called performative. That is, they're not describing the world, but doing something. Take the phrase, "I do," at a wedding. Or the statement, "I name this ship Queen Elizabeth." Or, "I bet you £5 that that dog will win the race." These statements, these performatives, don't just describe, they're not true or false, but are doing something at the time of their utterances. They are producing a new set of social affairs. Austin argued that these performatives were subject to convention, that there are a certain set of rules that are understood by those engaged in the performative act. You understand the rules and traditions of the wedding and what it involves. You understand the nature of a dog race and a bet. Austin goes on to make a further argument, though, that rather than any statement being descriptive or performative, all use of language has a performative dimension. He said any utterance has three components: the locutionary act, the illocutionary act, and the perlocutionary act. The locutionary act is the saying of something receivable, the description or the articulation of something meaningful that other people can understand. When I say the cat is sat on the mat, I am describing a state of affairs that I believe you will be able to receive and comprehend. The illocutionary act is the force that utterance has, the way I'm doing something in uttering it. If I say the cat is sat on the mat to my partner who's about to feed the cat, it has a very different meaning than if I say the phrase as a school teacher teaching grammar. Or take the phrase, "the ice is thin." That phrase might be uttered in a chemistry class with one meaning, but it might also be shouted by a policeman at someone walking on ice. Again, these are two very different meanings, and we have to understand the particular context, the performative context, to understand what's going on. Austin describes a number of ways an act can be illocutionary. Acts can appraise, assess, can order or vote, can promise, bet, deny, congratulate, thank, but they all have something in common. They're creating a set of affairs, not just describing them. The perlocutionary act is the consequence, the way the message is received by the other person and the world in general. The conventions and context must be understood by those involved for the performative to be successfully acted out. Austin describes this as being felicitous or infelicitous, meaning successful or unsuccessful. The circumstances, the conventions, and the rules should be appropriate, understood, and agreed upon for the utterance to be acted out felicitously. At a wedding, there's a set of social, cultural, and personal assumptions about what happens when you say "I do." You have to have a transparent and honest understanding of all of them for the performative to be successful in the future. You have to be serious, you have to be compos mentis, there have to be witnesses of some kind, you can't already be married, etc. The act must be well executed, not misunderstood, misapplied, or what Austin describes as misfiring.
The fall of Benito Mussolini echoed louder than the Allied guns. Benito, for 21 years a fascist Caesar. Now this from his own countrymen.
So, how can this help us understand political concepts like fascism? One major point is to understand and reflect upon what any utterance is doing, and it means looking at the context in which it's uttered. Political labels are used by politicians to describe what they themselves believe in an attempt to persuade others to believe in those things too. At the same time, citizens use them to describe themselves and who they're likely to support or agree with. So, when a person describes someone as a fascist, what are they doing? Well, there's the locutionary act, that the person being called a fascist is being labelled with some combination of the elements we discussed before. Which of these the accuser uses is actually usually unknown and assumed, at least unless there is some further reflection or investigation. Then there's the illocutionary act, the performance. The assumption, today at least, is that the person calling the person a fascist, and wider society, has attached a negative value judgment to the concept of fascism. The performative is one that asserts or recommends the exclusion of the person from public discourse at the very least. It's an attempt to convince others that the person is dangerous. The point of political discourse, at its most essential, is to convince others of the value of a position. Building a majority position in modern politics is of course fundamental. The illocutionary act is an attempt to build as big a majority position as possible, what Antonio Gramsci called hegemony, which is why the perlocutionary act is also important. It's the effect the act has, how it's received, what happens in the wider world when the term fascist is used. When someone calls someone a fascist, the illocutionary act, it seems to me, is to evaluate, convince, and ideally exclude the person from respectable discourse. This possible exclusion and the intent to exclude is only possible because of the way we've collectively devalued fascism societally. It seems that for the act to be received felicitously, by the conventions, by the rules of the game, the receiver has to agree with the description and to agree that the person should be excluded from public conversation. This would make a successful felicitous act. The intention being to convince as many people as possible of your point. This is precisely why precision in terminology is so important. If it's used without accuracy, it loses its potency and becomes less valuable. Returning to Eco's 14 points, we have an ideal type in each of our minds, differing from person to person, of how many of these principles we think are required for a person to be fascistic. We also weight them in different ways. Now, we can see quite obviously that Trump and some supporters display some of these, and I use Trump simply because he's the most obvious example right now. As Elia Bures has pointed out though, the problem with a concept like fascism is that it can always have some validity. A 2015 article in Slate argued that by Eco's definition, Trump displays at least 7 of the traits. And that might be true. But the fewer you use when adopting the term, the more likely that you'll run into more disagreement because of the imprecision of use. Which means you might be describing what you mean, the locutionary act, but the perlocutionary act is failing or misfiring because of the way it's being received. As Roger Griffin wrote, you can be a total xenophobic, racist, male chauvinist bastard and still not be a fascist. The point is this: what are you doing when you're using certain terms? Who are you trying to convince? Who are you talking to? What might the best way be of getting across to them? It's often been argued that Wittgenstein is the most influential philosopher of the 20th century for the reason that he split philosophy into 2 traditions, the continental and the analytic. And J.L. Austin, while not as widely known, is certainly as influential and becoming more so. His ideas about language being productive as well as descriptive laid the groundwork for much later thought in linguistic philosophy, as well as directly influencing a fundamental thread in gender studies in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Having an understanding of Austin is to understand what we're doing when speaking and writing, having a clearer purpose and a more reflective attitude. If you like these videos, I need your help, and here's my request. If you think you get the same value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video. That's $3 to $4 per month to keep this channel going. You can even limit your pledge to $1 a month, and if you pledge $5, I'll add your name to the credits. To those that already support Then and Now, thank you so much. This channel just wouldn't exist without you. You can also hit like, share, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these things really contribute to helping Then and Now grow. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.